I'm going to demonstrate for you what it means to critically interrogate discourses. We have talked about examining the discourses of war and asking questions about the foundations of these discourses, what gets foregrounded, what gets backgrounded, what gets said, what does not get said, and what are the taken for granted assumptions in these broader narratives of war. Today, we will examine the speech delivered by President Obama to the Syrian people in February 2013. And we will examine some of the taken for granted assumptions that play out in the speech. We will look at what some of the frames are that are foregrounded in this speech. We will also look at the kinds of things that are not said in this particular narrative. So, let's begin by paying attention to the speech.
For nearly 2 years, the Assad regime has waged a brutal war against the Syrian people, murdering innocent men, women, and children in their homes, in breadlines, and at universities. In the face of this barbarism, the United States has joined with nations around the world in calling for an end to the Assad regime and a transition that leads to a peaceful, inclusive, and democratic Syria, where the rights of all Syrians are protected.
Note in this small segment the emphasis on portraying the Assad regime as an oppressor. This portrayal of the Assad regime as an oppressor of the Syrian people serves as the backdrop for US intervention. US then emerges within this narrative as the catalyst for bringing about democracy, for promoting democracy in Syria. The portrayal of the Assad regime as an oppressor serves as the backdrop for US imperial intervention in the name of democracy promotion. The US calls for the end to the Assad regime, and this in itself is a powerful entry point to examine within the context of questions of sovereignty. Who is the US to call for an end to the Assad regime? When you ask that question, that raises important points for us to examine the role that is played by the US within the broader global narrative, the role played by US as an imperial power, and the role that it assumes as a so-called watchdog for democracy globally. And then it is important to question who empowers the US to be in that role. What is the source of power on the basis of which US puts itself in this position of articulating an oppressive space and within that enunciating its own role as a savior of the people? More importantly, when we pay attention to this narrative of democracy promotion, we have to ask questions about the empirical evidence. What have we seen from the recent history? What have we seen in the context of democracy promotion in Iraq? What have we seen with democracy promotion in Afghanistan? Are these spaces any closer to a democratic imagination? Whose democratic imaginations are these? And how are these democratic imaginations tied to the kinds of neoliberal imaginations that the US has for these particular spaces in the Middle East, both for its economic profits as well as for its geostrategic interests?
We've worked to isolate Assad and his regime, impose sanctions that starve the regime of funds, recognize the Syrian opposition coalition as the legitimate representative of the Syrian people.
Once again, note the implicit power in the position that's taken up by the US in imposing sanctions on the Assad regime, in isolating the Assad regime, in supporting the opposition. And the important question to ask within that narrative frame is once again, what is the assumed source of power from which US derives its position? What are its own agendas that are tied to this broader discourse of democracy? And more importantly, what are the sources of legitimacy on the basis of which the US makes its claims to power and to its imperial position? Interrogating that discourse demonstrates to us this black and white portrayal. Even as the Assad regime is portrayed in these narratives of darkness, the US automatically emerges within the implicit frame of being the savior. Enamored in whiteness and its halo of whiteness, coming in as the savior and as the protector of democracy. The questions we further need to ask is, what is this democracy that is being articulated here? Whose democracy is it? And what does this democracy really look like?
call for accountability for perpetrators of atrocities, and provide humanitarian relief to Syrians in need. The relief we send doesn't say made in America, but make no mistake, our aid reflects the commitment of the American people. American aid means food and clean water for millions of Syrians. American aid means medicine and treatment for hundreds of thousands of patients in Damascus, Daraa, and Homs. It means immunizations for 1 million Syrian children. American aid means winter supplies for more than 500,000 people in Aleppo, Homs, and Deir Zur.
Pay attention to the portrayal of American aid as the savior of the Syrian people. American aid is equated with food, water, clothing, shelter, access to medicine. American aid also is positioned as the commitment of the American people. But what really does this commitment translate into? What really are the actual outcomes on the ground? How much of this American aid really translates into food, water, clothing, shelter, access to medicine among the people of Syria? We don't have to look too far to examine the evidence base for the actual impact of this American aid. We can look at the example of Iraq, we can look at the example of Afghanistan, and we can really ask the question, to what extent has that American aid really translated? I think that base of empiricism, that base of asking questions of truth, and what do claims translate into, and do these claims measure up to what we actually see in reality, are important questions to be asked, especially within the context of an imperial position. You see, imperial powers historically have operated on this narrative of saving the other, of lifting the burden of the soul. But how much of the burden of the soul is really lifted is a question that one ought to be asking. As we have seen through the history of imperialism, often the presence of an imperial force has meant the actual deprivation of people in the colonies. How do present evidences of the commitment to aid translate into the reality of access to basic supplies? We also note within this frame, once again, this notion of the US being the source of accountability for national cultures and for nation states. Once again, we have to examine this question about why the US exists in this position of accountability. Geostrategically and in terms of distribution of global resources of power, what kinds of formations of power constitute the current position of the US within this global circuit? And again, asking that question really disrupts this frame that we see articulated within this narrative, and that also allows us to work through a space that questions the role of the US within this narrative.
That this aid reaches those in need. Today, we're taking another step. I've approved an additional $155 million in humanitarian aid for people in Syria and refugees fleeing the violence. Here, I want to speak directly to the people of Syria. This new aid will mean more warm clothing for children and medicine for the elderly, flour and wheat for your families, and blankets, boots, and stoves for those huddled in damaged buildings. It will mean health care for victims of sexual violence and field hospitals for the wounded. Even as we work to end the violence against you, this aid will help address some of the immediate needs you face each day.
The aid will help address some of the immediate needs you face each day. Now that is an empirical statement. The aid will provide more food, more clothing, more shelter, more access to medicine. That again is a statement that can be empirically investigated. Now is the time for us to ask this question: how much of these commitments and promises have really translated into reality? How much of these billion-dollar commitments into providing aid have translated into the actual lived experiences of Syrians having greater access to food, clothing, shelter, and medicine? And then more importantly, we also have to ask the question, to what extent does this narrative of aid further participate in the imperializing of the Syrian space in the hands of American powers, further than depriving people of the access to basic resources rather than actually bringing in long-term solutions of access. Short-term aid often does not translate into long-term commitments of infrastructure development. As we have seen in the case of Iraq, the promise to bring aid and to bring access to resources did not translate into greater access within the local contexts. People in Iraq continue to struggle with access to safe food, safe water, safe medical supplies. Where then has that aid gone? Why has that aid not actually improved the lives of Iraqi people? Are the lives of the Iraqi people better today than they were in the regime, under the regime of Saddam? These are the kinds of questions we ought to empirically be investigating when we think about juxtaposing the claims that are made within the discursive space.
This new commitment will bring America's total humanitarian aid to Syria to $365 million, making us the largest single donor of humanitarian assistance to the Syrian people. Today, I also call on the international community to do more to help these Syrians in need and to contribute to the latest UN humanitarian appeal. We're under no illusions. The days ahead will continue to be very difficult. But what's clear is that the regime continues to weaken and lose control of territory. The opposition continues to grow stronger. More Syrians are standing up for their dignity. The Assad regime will come to an end. The Syrian people will have their chance to forge their own future, and they will continue to find a partner in the United States of America.
The sovereignty of the Syrian people is framed within the imperial role of the United States. Implicit in this narrative is the imagination of the US as the savior. The US emerges as a catalyst that supports the Syrian opposition to enable the emergence of a voice in Syria. As I wrap up this deconstruction, let me ask, whose voice is it? Is it really the voice of the Syrian people? Or is it the voice of the American empire? Its geostrategic goals in securing global hegemony and its interests economically in turning Syria into another neoliberal space for experimentation? Our journeys in Iraq, looking at the empirical evidence in Iraq, suggest that Iraq, after the US intervention, was turned into a space for neoliberal experimentation. A massive open market for US businesses to play their games. Is it going to be the same for Syria? And does really democracy for the Syrian people, having an opportunity to participate for the Syrian people, translate into US-backed agendas of participation, control, and democracy as they fit within a broader US geostrategic agenda? Ultimately then, the narratives of empire, as we see in the context of the speech delivered to the Syrian people by President Obama, have to be interrogated within the broader context of the agendas of these narratives. What are these narratives seeking to achieve? In this sense, human rights, democracy, access to medicine, humanitarian aid are not neutral, feel-good concepts that sound good, but they also emerge as the tropes of the empire that seek to sustain and diffuse the global reach of the empire. Thank you.